In 1836, a series of architectural surveys conducted across several European and Asian territories began documenting large urban districts that appeared remarkably similar despite being separated by vast distances. Government records cataloged grand boulevards, identical building facades, symmetrical plazas, and carefully proportioned civic structures. These districts were eventually classified as products of 19th-century urban planning, often associated with imperial modernization projects. Yet when I examined earlier maps and engravings, something unusual began to appear. Many of these cities seem to emerge already organized into consistent geometric layouts, sometimes long before the official dates of their reconstruction. Street grids, monumental administrative buildings, and large civic squares followed repeating proportions that appeared across multiple regions. Today, these structures are presented as architectural heritage, monuments of classical or neoclassical design. Yet their uniformity raises an interesting question. What if these cities were not independently designed at all? What if they were constructed according to standardized urban modules, systems that once governed how entire cities were built, before later historical periods reclassified them simply as monuments? And if such a system existed, why does the historical record describe their origins so differently today? When I first began examining the architectural histories of several well-known cities, the official explanation appeared consistent and well-established. Historians generally describe the symmetrical districts of many European capitals as the product of 18th and 19th century modernization programs. Governments and imperial administrations sought to transform older medieval cities into orderly urban centers that reflected the ideals of classical architecture and centralized governance. In these accounts, wide boulevards replaced narrow medieval streets, monumental squares were constructed to host civic ceremonies, administrative buildings, theaters, and museums were placed within carefully designed urban frameworks intended to project stability and authority. Cities such as Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg are frequently cited as examples of this transformation. Architectural historians often point to large-scale urban projects commissioned by powerful rulers who wished to reshape their capitals according to contemporary aesthetic and political principles. When I examined official architectural records, I found detailed documentation describing some of these projects. City planning commissions issued design guidelines. Architects produced drawings that followed classical proportions. Buildings were constructed using styles that emphasized symmetry, columns, and uniform facades. In this narrative, similarities between cities are explained as the result of shared architectural movements. Neoclassicism, for example, spread across Europe during the 18th century. Architects studied similar treatises and drew inspiration from the same ancient models. Under this interpretation, it is not surprising that cities began to resemble one another. Urban modernization served practical goals. Wider streets improved transportation and sanitation. Organized squares allowed governments to administer public life more effectively. Uniform building heights created visual harmony. From this perspective, the repeating patterns found in many historic city districts represent deliberate planning decisions made by architects working within the same cultural framework. Yet, as I continued reviewing architectural archives and urban surveys, I noticed that not every example fit comfortably within this explanation. In several cases, the documentation describing the initial construction of entire districts was incomplete.
Records sometimes appeared to focus on renovations or redesigns rather than original construction. Surveyors occasionally described large portions of cities as if they already existed before the major modernization projects officially began. At first, these inconsistencies seemed minor. Historical documentation is rarely perfect, and many construction records are lost over time. However, the more maps, engravings, and architectural surveys I examined, the more a quiet question began to emerge. If these districts were built entirely during modernization periods, why do some of the earliest visual records already depict them in nearly complete form? That question became more difficult to ignore as I turned my attention to the earliest cartographic evidence.
My attention eventually shifted from architectural treatises to historical maps and travel accounts. These sources often capture cities at specific moments in time, providing visual snapshots that sometimes reveal details not emphasized in official narratives. While examining several early 18th century maps, I noticed something unusual. Certain cities appeared with large districts already laid out in precise geometric patterns. Streets intersected at consistent angles. Blocks were nearly identical in size, and public squares occupied central positions within carefully organized grids. What caught my attention was not simply the presence of these layouts, but the absence of gradual development surrounding them. In medieval cities, growth usually follows an organic pattern. Streets curve around older structures. Neighborhoods expand irregularly as populations increase. Architectural styles accumulate in layers over centuries. Yet in some of the maps I studied, entire districts seemed to appear with an unexpected level of uniformity. Travel journals from the same periods sometimes describe cities with remarkably consistent architecture across large areas. Observers noted rows of buildings sharing similar heights and proportions. In several cases, visitors commented on the unusual orderliness of these districts compared with older sections of the same city. What I found particularly interesting was the limited documentation describing the early construction phases of these areas. If entire districts were built within short periods during modernization programs, one might expect extensive records detailing their planning and construction. Major urban projects typically leave behind administrative documents, engineering reports, and financial accounts. Yet in some cases, these records appear incomplete or begin only after the districts were established. This observation does not necessarily contradict the official narrative. Historical records are often fragmented, and urban development can proceed in phases that are not always clearly documented. However, the visual evidence from maps and engravings raises a subtle question. Were these districts constructed rapidly during centralized modernization efforts, or were planners adapting urban spaces that had already been partially organized before those projects began? As I continued comparing maps from different regions, another pattern began to emerge. The geometric layouts observed in one city were not unique. Similar proportions, street arrangements, and building alignments appeared repeatedly across cities separated by vast distances. At first glance, this could simply reflect the spread of architectural fashion. Yet the repetition of certain spatial ratios suggested the possibility of something more systematic. To explore this further, I began comparing architectural surveys from multiple countries. What I found suggested that these similarities extended beyond individual cities and into broader geographic patterns. As my research expanded, I began comparing architectural surveys and urban maps from cities across Europe and parts of Asia. What initially appeared as isolated similarities gradually began to form recognizable patterns. In several cities separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers, entire districts followed remarkably similar spatial arrangements. Streets intersected at consistent angles, often forming rectangular grids whose proportions appeared carefully measured. Central squares occupied prominent positions within these grids, frequently aligned with major administrative buildings. When I examined building facades within these districts, the similarities continued. Rows of structures shared nearly identical window spacing. Floor heights remained consistent across entire blocks. Decorative elements such as columns, arches, and cornices followed repeating proportions that appeared in multiple regions. Architectural historians often attribute these similarities to the spread of neoclassical design principles. Pattern books and architectural manuals circulated widely during the 18th and 19th centuries, providing builders with standardized aesthetic guidelines. This explanation certainly accounts for some of the shared visual characteristics. However, as I compared measurements recorded in architectural surveys, another detail began to stand out. The dimensions of city blocks themselves often followed similar ratios. In several cases, blocks measured nearly identical lengths and widths, even in cities governed by different empires and constructed during supposedly different time periods. I also noticed that certain types of civic buildings appeared repeatedly within these layouts. Administrative halls, theaters, and large institutional buildings were frequently positioned along central axes leading toward major squares. These axes often aligned with canals or radial streets that extended outward toward surrounding districts. The resulting urban forms created balanced geometric compositions that seemed remarkably consistent across regions. One might expect some variation when cities develop independently under different cultural conditions. Yet the recurrence of these patterns suggests the possibility that similar planning frameworks were being applied repeatedly. Another observation emerged when examining infrastructure. In several cities, canals followed straight paths aligned with street grids. Bridges crossed at consistent intervals. Public spaces appeared at predictable distances from one another. These details may reflect practical considerations in urban engineering, but when they appear repeatedly across large geographic areas, they raise an intriguing question. Were architects independently arriving at the same solutions to urban design challenges, or were they following standardized planning principles that guided the construction of entire districts? The evidence suggests that repeating geometric relationships exist across many historic cities. Whether these similarities reflect shared architectural traditions or a deeper system of urban organization remains open to interpretation. However, the recurrence of these patterns encouraged me to consider a possibility that extends beyond individual buildings or districts. What if entire cities, or at least major portions of them, were constructed using modular planning systems designed to replicate consistent urban forms? Exploring that possibility requires examining how such systems might have functioned in practice.
As I continued studying historical architectural records, the idea of modular planning gradually began to take shape. Modern construction frequently relies on standardized components. Buildings are often assembled from repeating structural units designed to simplify construction and ensure consistent proportions. When I began examining historical urban layouts through this lens, several details appeared in a new light. Many historic city districts follow grid patterns that divide land into repeating rectangular blocks. These blocks often maintain consistent dimensions across entire neighborhoods. Streets between them remain similar in width, and building heights frequently align with predetermined ratios. If such patterns were intentional, they may reflect planning systems designed to organize urban development efficiently. One possible approach would involve dividing a city into modules, standardized spatial units within which buildings could be constructed according to predefined templates. Within each module, builders might follow consistent rules governing building height, facade alignment, and street placement. Such a system would allow large urban districts to be constructed quickly while maintaining architectural harmony. Evidence for standardized building practices appear in several historical sources. Architectural manuals from the 18th and 19th centuries include measured drawings showing ideal proportions for doors, windows, and structural elements. Builders could reproduce these designs repeatedly without creating entirely new plans for each building. Urban planning documents sometimes describe entire streets constructed with uniform facades, creating the appearance of continuous architectural compositions. If these principles were extended to larger scales, entire districts could be assembled using repeating modules. The result would be cities whose layouts appear remarkably consistent across large areas. While examining historical engravings, I also noticed that construction techniques may have supported this approach. Many buildings within these districts share similar structural frameworks. Brick walls, stone facades, and standardized window openings appear repeatedly. This repetition suggests that builders may have relied on established construction templates rather than designing each building individually. Such practices would not necessarily imply the existence of a single centralized system governing all cities. Different regions could adopt similar modular planning principles independently. Yet, the widespread recurrence of consistent urban proportions raises the possibility that standardized planning frameworks were more influential than commonly recognized. If urban districts were built using modular systems, the process of city construction might have been faster and more coordinated than traditional narratives suggest. Entire neighborhoods could be planned and built according to pre-existing design standards. The architectural uniformity visible in many historic cities may reflect, therefore, more than aesthetic preference. It may represent the visible traces of systematic urban design methods that once guided large-scale construction. However, if such systems played a significant role in shaping these cities, another question emerges. Why do modern historical narratives emphasize individual architects and rulers rather than broader construction systems? The answer may lie in the transformations that cities experienced in later historical periods.
Cultural resets and urban reclassification. As the 19th century progressed, many cities across Europe and Asia experienced periods of rapid transformation. Industrialization, political upheaval, fires, and wars altered urban landscapes in ways that required extensive reconstruction. When these periods were examined, municipal archives often focused on restoration and adaptation rather than initial construction. Buildings were repaired after fires, expanded to accommodate new institutions, or modified to align with changing political symbolism. In some cases, entire districts were reassigned new functions. Administrative buildings became museums. Former residences of officials were converted into government offices. Public squares acquired monuments commemorating new historical narratives. This process of adaptation may have gradually altered how cities were understood. Structures that originally served practical roles within functioning urban systems could later be interpreted as monuments representing earlier cultural eras. When architectural historians attempted to trace the origins of these structures, they often relied on the documentation available at the time. If earlier records were incomplete or lost, the most visible phase of reconstruction sometimes became associated with the building's origin.
This phenomenon appears in several historical accounts, where major renovations are described almost as if they were original construction projects. Over time, such reinterpretations may have contributed to the reclassification of entire districts. Buildings became symbols of specific architectural movements. Urban layouts were attributed to particular rulers or architects whose involvement may have been limited to later modifications. The physical structures remained the same, but their historical narratives gradually shifted. This does not necessarily imply deliberate revision of history. Urban documentation evolves as cities change, and interpretations often reflect the information available to historians at a given time. Yet the cumulative effect of these reinterpretations may have obscured earlier construction systems that once governed how cities were organized. If modular planning frameworks existed during earlier periods, later renovations could have masked their origins. By the early 20th century, many cities had undergone multiple layers of reconstruction. New infrastructure, modern transportation systems, and expanding populations reshaped urban landscapes once again. As a result, the underlying design principles that initially guided these districts may no longer be immediately visible. The cities we see today therefore represent the result of continuous transformation. And this raises an intriguing question. If earlier urban systems once existed beneath these layers of reconstruction, how might we recognize their traces within modern city landscapes?
In the present day, modular design has become a central principle of urban development. Prefabricated building systems allow entire neighborhoods to be constructed using standardized components. Streets are planned according to consistent dimensions. Infrastructure is designed to integrate efficiently with repeating urban blocks. When viewed from above, modern developments often reveal highly organized geometric patterns. Urban planners frequently rely on modular grids because they simplify construction, reduce costs, and create predictable spatial relationships. While studying these modern practices, I began to reflect on the repeating patterns observed in historic cities. Many of the same principles appear to be present. Regular block dimensions, consistent building heights, and carefully aligned civic spaces all contribute to organized urban forms that resemble modular systems. This similarity does not prove that earlier societies used identical planning methods. However, it suggests that standardized urban design may have deeper historical roots than is sometimes acknowledged. If earlier builders developed effective modular planning systems, those methods might have been transmitted across regions through architectural education, administrative coordination, or shared engineering traditions. Alternatively, similar urban forms may have emerged independently as practical solutions to the challenges of organizing growing populations within limited space. Both possibilities remain plausible. What remains intriguing is the consistency of certain spatial relationships across cities that developed under very different historical circumstances. The evidence suggests that repeating patterns exist within the architecture and layouts of many historic urban districts. Whether these patterns reflect shared cultural influences, standardized planning systems, or other factors is still open to interpretation. As I continue examining historical maps, architectural surveys, and modern satellite imagery, I find myself returning to the same question that first emerged while studying those early 19th century surveys. Are the similarities between these cities simply the result of architectural fashion and modernization, or might they represent the visible remnants of planning systems whose principles have gradually faded from historical memory? The cities themselves do not provide clear answers. Their streets, plazas, and buildings remain in place, continuing to serve the populations that inhabit them today.
Yet beneath these living landscapes may lie traces of earlier design frameworks, systems that once guided how entire cities were organized and whose origins may still be waiting to be understood.